Good morning, everyone. It's Mrs. Nybert back with the Wild Robot Escapes. I believe where you left off was the end of chapter 56. So I'm going to start with chapter 57 today. The Stones. At first light, Roz nudged Brightbill awake, and the travelers continued north through the mountains. The goose stood on his mother's shoulders as she marched. His eyes darted around nervously, searching for any sign of the wolves. But the wolves were gone, and our friends turned their attention to a new problem. The weather out there was always changing. Roz and Brightbill had seen many calm, sunny days suddenly turn to wind or fog or sleet or even snow. Our friends expected bad weather, so they hardly noticed when heavy rain came sweeping down a valley. But there was something odd about this rain. Brightbill squinted at the oncoming storm and said, "Ma, why is the rain bouncing off the ground?" What kind of rain bounces off the ground? Bouncing rain? That didn't seem right. The robot's computer brain went to work and she found the correct word. "That is not rain," she said. "That is hail." Clang! A hailstone bounced off Roz's chest. Another one swooshed into the weeds, and then the sky opened up and hailstones were everywhere. They tore through the leaves and branches. They ricocheted off of rocks and roots. They flattened flowers and bushes. To the robot, the hailstones were annoying. To the goose, they were deadly. A stone hit Brightbill's shoulder and he fell to the ground. Roz scooped him up, hunching over, protecting him from the falling stones. But the hailstone might kill the poor bird if they couldn't find cover soon. Frantically, the robot scanned the area for any type of shelter. And there it was. On the far side of the valley, beside a winding river, was a cabin. It was old and shabby, but it had a roof, and that's what our friends needed the most. Roz held her son close, pumping her legs and thundering across the valley. Heavy hailstones hissed into the grass and squelched into the mud and clanged off of our robot. There was a soft thump and Brightbill cried out in pain. Roz bounded over the rushing river in a single leap, landed without breaking stride, and kept running. Now she could hear hailstones cracking against the cabin, louder and louder. The robot stomped up to the front door, turned the handle, and stepped inside. It's interesting. I'm going to show you this picture here of her running toward the cabin. In my mind, I don't think I've ever pictured her with two legs. I've always thought of her having almost like a triangle kind of pod at the bottom that kind of rolled and had I don't know, what are those called, Joe? Like a belt almost that kind of ran over land. I never pictured her being able to run, if you will. Chapter 58, The Cabin. The hailstorm was brief but violent. Its icy stones were quickly melting away, but the damage would linger on. The valley was littered with shredded leaves and wildflowers. Wounded animals were hobbling back to their homes, and several unlucky birds lay limp in the grass. Inside the cabin, Roz was standing by the window. She held Brightbill in her arms, his bruised body wrapped in an old blanket. The robot knew everything there was to know about caring for animals, but all her son needed was time. His injuries would heal on their own. "Go on without me, Ma," said the goose in a weak voice. "I'll catch up to you when I'm feeling better." "That is ridiculous," said the robot. "What kind of mother would I be if I leave my injured son behind?" "But, Ma—" "Stop talking," interrupted Roz. "You need rest." Brightbill tried to argue, but he was already falling asleep. The cabin was simple, just a square room with a wood stove, 2 chairs beside a table, and a couple of cots rotting in the corner. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on a shelf. Otherwise, the walls were bare. It was clear no humans had been there for a very long time. I just heard William. talking in the other room, saying that me reading aloud woke him up. So hopefully he'll forgive me later. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on a shelf. Otherwise, the walls were bare. It was clear no humans had been there for a very long time. However, it seemed that some other creatures had moved in. The whole place had a foul odor. Lumps of feces were strewn about, and little footprints trailed away from a dark hole in the floor. Roz leaned over the hole, and in a language of animals, she said, "Hello, is anyone down there?" Something moved, and then a pair of shining eyes looked up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said a voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." "I am sorry to intrude," said the robot. "My son and I were only trying to escape the hailstorm." "Your son?" said the voice. "Is that him in your arms? Let me see." Very gently, the robot lifted a fold of cloth and revealed the sleeping goose. "He must take after his father," said the voice. "He is my adopted son," the robot explained. "My name is Roz, and this is Brightbill." Good morning, Maddie. The shining eyes blinked, and the voice squeaked with excitement. "You're Roz and Brightbill? The birds have been singing about you for months. You're a living legend." "You're living legends." "Technically, I am not living," said the robot. "You seem pretty alive to me," said the voice. "Either way, it's nice to meet ya. They call me Sprinkles." With that, the creature crawled up through the hole in the floor. She was covered in black fur from her nose all the way to the tip of her fluffy tail. Well, except for those white stripes running down her back. You see, Sprinkles was a skunk. The robot took one look at her and stepped backwards. Sprinkles frowned. "You know, Roz, skunks only get stinky when we're nervous." "Are you nervous now?" "Well, sort of, but in a good way. I'm honored to meet you. Please pull up a seat and tell me what brings you here." "Good morning, Will." Sprinkles hopped onto the table and listened as Roz described their journey. The skunk was a very good listener. While Roz spoke, Sprinkles nodded politely and said things like, "Oh my," and "Is that right?" and "You don't say." This went on until Brightbill began to stir. "Ma, I'm thirsty," he whispered. "Well, there's a creek right out back," said Sprinkles, "and those might be useful." She motioned to the bowls on the shelf. "Please, help yourself to anything. My home is your home." It turns out skunks can be quite hospitable. Sprinkles invited the visitors to stay as long as they liked, and so our friends spent Brightbill's recovery in the cabin. The goose mostly slept. The robot brought him water and food. The skunk made sure both were comfortable. A few mornings later, sunlight streamed in through the window and onto Brightbill. He was squawking and waddling and fluttering through the cabin. His injuries had healed, but he was eager to continue on their journey. "Thanks for everything, Sprinkles." "Sprinkles," the robot waved as she marched away from the cabin with her son on her shoulder. "Glad I could help," called the skunk. "Misunderstood creatures like us gotta look out for each other." Chapter 59, The Strange Wilderness. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains. Here and there, the sun broke through the clouds, and bright streaks came shining down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over a rugged mountainside and found our friends. For a moment, the robot and the goose basked in the warm sunlight. Then the patch of light moved on and rolled onto the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. The industrial site is buildings used for making things, so it's more commercialized. A patchwork of large boxy structures were nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up from holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout that mountain range were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like no trespassing and no hunting. It seemed humans had once lived and worked in the wilderness, only to leave it all behind. In places, though, there was still activity, robot activity. Armies of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels and built new dams and worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings and hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and went on their way. I'll read this chapter. Chapter 60, The Hunters. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into the wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, and fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Crack! Roz and Brightville were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, that was proving difficult. The trees were tightly packed together, and the undergrowth was tough and tangled. So they followed the deer paths that cut through this part of the forest, but they never knew when or where the next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard, and then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth, and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightville. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up to a tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in these mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightville. "What's he doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe you should put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. "We're here to hunt deer," he said, "but it looks like we're having goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightville the way we do Reader, I'm sure they would have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightville was just another goose, a meal, and they were getting hungry. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His fingers reached for the trigger. And then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind, footsteps. Something was stomping toward the hunters. Their rifles were ripped away, bent into hooks, and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manners of beasts, but they'd never come across well, they didn't know what this thing was. It looked like a tree stump, standing on two long roots with branches hanging from its sides. The men stumbled backwards, eyes and mouths opened wide, and then they turned and ran, and their terrified noises trailed off through the leaf litter. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I am so sorry, Brightville," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are safe now, I promise." So what was that came and scared away the hunters? How do you know? What clue is given to us right there at the end that you know how the hunters or who scared off the hunters? Leave me a message on the Read Aloud. Take care.